we can do comprehensive tax reform right. It would be something real positive for the state. It would be something that would help taxpayers, it could help the economy, it could help us for economic development, and it could help us in the long term meet the many funding needs that we all know that we have that are out there that are just important. As Americans, it's in our DNA not to like taxes. I mean, we were born in a tax rebellion. It's kind of who we are. But we've always, throughout the history of the country, and I think the history of the state, invested where we needed to invest. You know, a couple of facts I think are important to understand in tax reform. I mean, one is Georgia's a low-tax state, no matter how you look at it. And there are multiple ways that economists can look at this, whether it's as state and local taxes, as a per capita level, as a percentage of income level. Georgia tends to be 40th, 44th, 43rd in just about every tax structure that you look at. It's the same way of corporate taxes, the same way of personal taxes. And one of the policy questions is, you know, is the goal to move Georgia down to 50th, or is the goal to solve some of the public policy problems that we know we have? And in dealing with tax reform, that's also a really important aspect that we need to have a handle on and understanding of. It's important to understand what state and local governments spend their money on. And over 3/4 of the state budget is spent on education, healthcare, and criminal justice. If you add in things like, you know, DHR, health and social services, transportation, debt service, and we actually have a tax cut appropriated in the budget, which people forget, the homeowners tax relief grant, everything else the state does is less than 4% of the budget. And that's really important to understand, because if we go through a time, whether it's through a recession or if we do tax reform in such a way that we leave ourselves short of revenues, the only way to balance the budget is you almost have to cut education, healthcare, which is, again, why it's really, really important that whatever we do in tax reform, we're assured that we have the revenues that we need to avoid that. And if there's a reason that property taxes have increased in the last 4 or 5 years, it tends to be because of education. State funding of education has declined since 2001, while the local funding, which is mostly property taxes, has been increasing. And it's basically the reason one of the major reasons local property taxes are increasing is because state funding for education has declined over that time. So when I talk about tax reform, I think of it as, you know, a comprehensive what we do: property tax, sales tax, income tax, corporate tax, and how do we make the whole system better, more efficient, and be able to raise the revenues that we need to do what we need to do. With the Great Plan, what it's morphed into, it's not really tax reform, it's basically a tax swap. What we're doing is swapping out property taxes for an expanded sales tax. H.R. 900, very simply, it eliminates the homestead property tax for education. It eliminates the property tax on personal motor vehicles. School districts and local governments ought to receive lost property tax revenue from the state. And there's a low-income tax credit against the grocery tax. To pay for all of this, we will institute a sales tax. We'll be expanding the sales tax base and instituting a sales tax on consumer services. So things like haircuts, lawn care, it'll be personal, legal, or accounting services. There's a whole menu of items like that will be expanded to the sales tax base. Lottery tickets, and we'll be putting the sales tax back on groceries. In the Senate legislation, we're talking about is basically capping an increase in property tax revenues. It's property tax revenues would not be able to grow faster than population and government inflation. There would be a local referendum would be allowed to go if you go above the cap. And you'd be freezing homestead values to the 2007 homestead value, and in future years you could increase it by 1%. And that, again, will have a very dramatic effect on local governments, on education, cities, counties, on what the pie of their budget could possibly be. There are several principles of tax reform that I think is really important that should drive the whole discussion. And they revolve on adequacy, fairness, and local control. I mean, is tax reform linked to budget needs? I mean, that is really, again, the reason we have a tax system is to fund a state budget, to fund services, to fund local and obviously local budgets, the same thing. Is it fair? I mean, who are the winners and losers? And whatever tax changes we make, there are going to be winners and losers. And we need to be very honest about that and lay that out so people understand what that is. And local control, which has become a real important issue in the last 4 or 5 months in discussing the Great Plan, is local decision-making strengthened or weakened? I mean, it is, I think it's a real strong principle that when it comes to local government funding, we have 535 cities and 180 school districts and 159 counties. That's an awful lot of local governing authorities. Talking about adequacy, I mean, is tax reform, is it linked to the budget needs? And there are certain things that drive, for the state budget, there are certain things that drive the state budget. Education is one of the biggest cost drivers. And there are long-term budget needs we know we have. Whatever we do in tax reform has got to develop a revenue stream that we can pay for those things. What are the major issues? The first question, again, in my mind, it gets to adequacy, is does the math work? Can we replace property taxes for education and the personal motor vehicle tax with the expanded sales tax base, with the tax on groceries, and with the lottery tickets? But in the current plan as it is, there are no numbers. There are some 3- or 4-year-old studies that are not directly related to this proposal, but that were done for other reasons that you can kind of get an idea of how the math works out. We're probably $500, $700, $800 million short. But we've got to make up that money in some other way. And this is a constitutional amendment. I mean, we can't, if this passes and it gets on the ballot and it passes, it's extremely difficult to change. So it makes this extremely risky. And then the fairness, who are the winners and losers? I mean, Georgia, currently, the state and local tax system is regressive. I mean, that means those at the lower end of the income scale pay a higher percentage of the taxes than those on the upper end of the income scale. And one of the questions that we have to ask whatever proposal is being floated in tax reform, does this make this better or worse? I mean, again, this is a tax shift. Low and moderate income will pay more, while upper income will pay less. And that's basically because as you shift from a property tax to a sales tax, those on the low end of the income scale spend more of their money on taxable service, on taxable items than those at the upper end. And this will make it less fair. The elderly who do not currently pay education property tax will end up paying more, renters will pay more, and homeowners who itemize will lose federal income tax deductions. Local control, again, with all the different counties, cities, school districts, there's different needs and values throughout the state, and we need to develop a system that recognizes and respects those different needs and values. If in the city of Decatur, they want to have very high property taxes to have a very good school system, which I think is the choice those citizens made, who is it in Atlanta to tell them that you can't do that? I mean, the Senate part of the bill is the bill that really dramatically affects the local control by freezing the assessments to basically allowing only 1% growth in assessments, in addition to capping the growth of revenues. You will really limit the flexibility and the options that local governments have. And this will really have an effect on the faster growing cities, counties, and school districts. And education funding will be dramatically affected. I mean, will state funding for education be adequate? I mean, again, the current funding formula is still facing austerity cuts. I mean, we've already gone through the recovery, and we've never fully funded the formula from the last recession. And we seem to be hitting into, at the minimum, a slowdown, and maybe even another recession, before we've even fully funded education and recovered from the last one. It's important to have a balanced system of a sales, property, and income tax that I think is a principle of a well-thought-out tax system. Again, looking at property tax, there are strengths and weaknesses to all the taxes. And I think the key is to build on the strengths and to fix the weaknesses. The biggest weakness of the property tax is it's not based on ability to pay. But so the question is, do you get rid of it? Or can you link it somewhat to ability to pay? And I think it's important to acknowledge that property taxes can be a problem for folks. I mean, especially in fast-growing areas. So are there things that we can help families like that for? And there are. There's things called there's something called a circuit breaker, which basically limits how much property tax you'll pay based on your income. An example, if a homeowner earning $40,000 in income, if they paid $2,500 in property taxes, and we put in a circuit breaker saying that you will pay no more than 3.5% of your income in property taxes, they get a refund of everything above that. So in this situation, you get a refund of $1,100. You don't eliminate property taxes. It doesn't affect local governments because the refund comes from the state. It's really a state tax cut. But it's a way of helping those low, moderate income homeowners whose property tax bills become burdensome to them. And that's something I think is important to acknowledge, but it's also important to acknowledge you can fix that. There's a policy solution to that. The bottom line is there's no free lunch. I mean, we can give tax cuts to a majority of Georgians. To assure adequacy, tax cuts have to be paid for. I mean, that's the bottom line. It is very easy for any politician to step up in front of any room and promise that everyone in this room, everyone in this state will pay less taxes and it won't have an effect on the budget. That's fantasy land. I mean, it's just not going to happen. If it seems too good to be true, it generally is. It's the single most important concept of tax reform, because what you'll be promised, what the citizens will be promised, is everyone will pay less and will be able to fund education, fund transportation, fund water, fund mental health, fund child protective services, you name it, and everyone will pay less in taxes. Well, you don't need a PhD to understand that the math just doesn't work on that. So as whatever proposal is being floated out there, there are some really important questions that every legislator needs to be asked and forced to answer. And the questions revolve around, does the math work? Who are the winners and losers? And how is this going to affect my local governments?